in this video, we'll be covering about the NIST security standards. Okay, so the NIST security standard, out of those, the SP800-30 outlines the 9 risk assessment activities as part of its standard. Okay, so this is the one that is relatively similar to the ISO security standard and its procedure we looked in the previous video. Okay, so you will see that actually quite a lot of boxes will overlap, and as a whole, the stages that you follow through will be very similar to the ISO we've seen before, but they do specify slightly different items, so that's why we want to have a look. Okay, so let's have a look. Firstly, system characterization. So in ISO, we looked at about identifying procedures and policies, but in NIST, what we start with is more about what we're dealing with, all right? What are the objects and entities that are in play, and go from there. So it's kind of like a bottom-up approach, dealing with what we have and then identifying first, whereas the ISO, what we're trying to get and then trying to map it out before. Okay, so here the inputs includes like hardware, software, interfaces, information, people, missions, etc. And all of those can be used to understand about the system boundaries, the functions, criticality, sensitivity, and so forth. Okay, so we first characterize it. So we're doing the bottom-up approach. And once we characterize the system, then we can start to look for threats. In the second stage of threat identification, we can identify history of system attack, data from intelligence agencies, and so forth that can be inputted into create a threat statement. So this is this step is similar to the ISO standards, right? So we want to know what are the impact to people using the system, and how can we go about preventing it. So once we understand about the threats of the system, then we can start look for the vulnerabilities that are enabling those threats. So the next step is the vulnerability identification. Things like reports from prior risk assessments, audit comments, security requirements, security test results, and so forth. Okay, so basically at this point, the tasks that are outlined in the NIST procedure is similar to the ISO one. Okay, so we try to identify what kind of vulnerabilities are enabling the threats, so that we can mitigate them. Okay, so as an output of this particular step, we're going to have a list of potential vulnerabilities. So if you remember about the ISO standards, we also had to produce the potential threats. Okay, and basically it maps back to the NIST step 2 and 3. Okay, so once we identify the vulnerabilities, then we can start looking at what kind of security controls solutions we can implement. So the next stage is control analysis. This one does take into consideration what the current controls are and how the planned controls can be used to patch the vulnerabilities that we have identified previously. So as a result of this stage, you're going to output the list of current and planned controls, where the planned ones are the new ones you're trying to implement in order to mitigate some of the vulnerabilities that you have discovered. Okay, so once we have identified all the controls that we want to implement, then we need to evaluate further about how to go about prioritizing them. So the next step involves a likelihood determination. Because if you think about an attack, not attacks are equally likely to happen, and therefore, if we are spending more time and resource into an attack that are less likely to happen, then it may not be a good return on investment per se. So what we like to do is evaluate how an attack may instantiate and become an actionable item that we need to address. So in this stage, what we want to do is find out what are the threat motivations are like, the capacity, nature of the vulnerability, current controls, and using all of that information, we can create a likelihood rating of those vulnerabilities. Okay? So once we have identified the likelihood of those vulnerabilities, we can assess the impact that are potential to our system. Okay? So in the impact analysis, you can kind of see based on the middle figure is similar to when we did the analysis at the ISO standards. So you can see that once we collected enough data, we do the analysis. Okay, same here. Okay, so we have collected those data. We can now evaluate the impact and produce an impact rating. So the outputs of those procedures are slightly different. So previously in the ISO, we produced the risk assessment report, but here what we're producing is an impact rating. Okay. However, they both capture similar aspects of the system, but it's just the perspective is slightly different. So just be wary about that. Okay. So once we understood about the impact applied to our system when such different attacks and threats are realized, then we can do some risk determination. Okay, so we can see here now we're trying to prioritize what we need to apply and what kind of solutions that can be used to negate some of those vulnerabilities that we have found. Okay, so once we understood what can be done to address those vulnerabilities, then we recommend security controls that can be implemented. Okay, and to recommend those controls, of course, you need to prioritize and also understand about constraints that may restrict how we can implement some of the security controls here. Okay, and finally, result documentation is produced about the things that have been found and what are the actions taken in order to address those issues. Okay, so you see that this is slightly different to the ISO where you don't have the loop control and it doesn't really produce the certification. Okay, however, the procedure is very similar where you identify the requirements, the issues, solutions, and you select solutions to implement. And this procedure can be put back into a cycle where you can restart and reevaluate and continuously enhance your security over time. As we've seen, there are a lot of similarities between the two procedures, the ISO and NIST. However, there are also some differences where it may affect how the security can be changed as a result of those standards. Okay. So we talked about how to address some of the risk, and there are a few different ways of treating the risk. So when we talked about the ISO standard, not only patching the vulnerability, but we were also talking about like responsibility and accountability, and those are other ways of treating the risk. For instance, the very naive approach is risk acceptance. Okay, so we understand the risk, but we don't do anything about it. And this can happen if you, for example, you are running a server and there is a chance of a denial of service attack, but you have many redundant servers that can take a place of the original server, or you have a very good load balanced, then you may just accept that risk, for instance, rather than trying to address that. Yeah? There's a risk avoidance. Take actions to prevent this risk from happening. So which means you're trying to not implement some features that will enable such risk from happening, for instance. So example here will be that your system uses C, which potentially have a buffer overflow vulnerabilities. So you wipe that out and use Java instead. Okay, you migrate to Java. Then you are technically trying to get rid of buffer overflow. However, you may end up with other vulnerabilities, but that's what you're trying to do in terms of the risk avoidance. Okay? Risk transfer, you can shift the risk to other assets, processes, or organizations. A good example is outsourcing the other organizations, getting insurances, and etc. Okay? So this is where you transfer your accountability to other entities to address the risk that's found. Okay? And the things that we have been seeing in the past falls into the last two categories. Either we reduce the consequence or reduce the likelihood. And both of them will be looking at implementing security controls. Okay? So What's the difference? You can pause the video here and have a think. Okay, so if you have thought about it, well, in terms of reducing the consequence, then that's more related to do with what happens as a result of an attack. Okay, so if we create like an offsite backup, disaster recovery plans, replications, then even if the attack is realized, you can always bounce back to the normal operation quickly. Whereas the reduce the likelihood is trying to preempt the potential threats from happening. So this is like implementing security controls like firewall, password, complexity management, policies, etc. So in terms of reducing the consequence, we're not directly reducing the impact of the attack, but we are able to fall back to our backups and other functionalities to provide the same service, whereas the reduce the likelihood is directly trying to impact a potential threat that can be realized into the system. Okay, so we do have a quick quiz as the final thing. So here I'd say discuss with your peers, but I assume most of you will be watching this without peers, so you can cross that out. Oh. There you go. Discuss with yourself about those 3 points. Okay. And actually, I will leave that as the final thoughts of the video. If you have some ideas, you can talk to me directly and discuss about it. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Bye.